You start to see people differently. You start to see these situations and these systems not so much as you deserve or that's your fault, but what in my life has been there that allowed me to never be at risk of or go there. You talk to guards inside, they'll say things like the only difference between the guard and the person that's incarcerated is you got caught, right?
Sure.
And I didn't.
Yeah.
So many guards inside are getting OWIs, they have drug addiction issues, there's DV, there's just a variety of things going on that they could easily be in that position. So it's just, there's this massive, if not for the grace of God, there go I, element of the whole system.
This is Cross-Examined, the legal podcast for people who want to know about their rights and talk about the American justice system. I'm defense attorney Alexis Garuz. With me today is Shannon Ross. Shannon, thank you for coming on today. Shannon, you and I met through Forward 48, which is kind of like a Milwaukee area, I guess, leadership development thing. That may be a simplistic way of putting it, but I think that we were probably paired in the same cohort because of some similarities in terms of kind of what we do. But you are executive director of the community. You are very active in the reentry space, among many other things that you do, and I know that's underselling it. So please tell our listeners a little bit about you and kind of what has led you to where you are right now.
Yeah, thank you for the invite. Did meet at Forward 48. I think that's an accurate description of what it is. I kind of look at it as a networking experience group as well that you're in, just to kind of continue to kind of know folks and be able to build post the the leadership training element. That was 6 weeks. This is turning into a lot more about Forward 48. So
we should have them plug for
right,
the player,
yeah,
apparently.
Yeah. So yeah, the work that I do is largely around the justice space. I found myself in the past maybe 2 years getting more involved in like community work, but that justice element emphasis is always the main thing of what I do. So the organization that I have, the community, is a nonprofit that's focused on helping folks that are incarcerated become as prepared as possible prior to release. We have a couple of things we do under our pre-entry banner. And then we have our Correcting the Narrative work, which is our outreach work to showcase the successes, humanity, and agency of people that have criminal records. And again, there's like different ways that we do that. One was our annual celebration recently, which you graciously were one of our sponsors for. And I am involved in a collaborative not too far from here, 11th and Mitchell, called The Beginning. It's a large mix of different for-profit and nonprofits doing community work within a 70,000 square foot space that we're also co-developing with the owner to refurbish this historical property on historic Mitchell. And I don't even know how I get into other areas, higher education and prison work. It's just different things in that same realm.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us a little bit about how did the community come to be? And when I say the community, I'm talking about your organization specifically, just so that we're not confusing any viewers. But tell us how that started. Tell us what was kind of the lead up to you to want to launch a project like this.
Yeah, and you got caught up in the generic nameness of it, having to explain it, because I commonly have to do that when I explain who I am. I'm like, it's an organization called, I'm not the self-appointed executive director of the overall community. And what brought me to that work is, it's a couple of things, but the main one is I spent 17 years in prison. And so being in that space, seeing what the system was doing, what it is still doing, I am at this moment right now serving the out portion of my time, which is about 11 years. So, I tell people you're not looking at a free person, you're looking at somebody who is technically still very much like in prison. They just allow me to walk amongst the free folks because I could go back in at any moment for, various things. And experiencing that and then being out here, it's kind of, I can never unsee the elephant of, what I went through and what I lived in for so long. And so many folks that I care about deeply and that I love, that are inside still or that were inside that are now dealing with the ramifications of that experience in a way that have been able to like navigate around because of support in my life. So that was really just the impetus for how, I got into this work and why I continue to do it.
So you talked a little bit about having support in your life. What role do you think that support plays for people who are incarcerated? Because I think one of the things that I have come across in dealing with cases where some of my clients end up going to prison is, the concern about where will they be placed, right? Are they going to be in a place where it's convenient or easy for family members, if they have a support system like that, to visit them regularly, to stay in contact? And so I think part of that aspect of going to prison, right, separates people in a lot of ways from there's good and bad, right? Like to some extent, okay, perhaps you're not involved with people who may have contributed to the reason that you are serving time. But on the other hand, it also serves to separate people from positive connections, right? So tell us a little bit about that. And I'm just curious to kind of know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think of a story. I think of an explanation, and then like more of a direct answer. So the kind of a theme that I find interesting in life is that so many of us that have made our way to a place of like sustainability, of health, of not being at risk of homelessness or going to prison or addiction, we have this view of ourselves as we've done these things, right? Like, oh, I accomplished this, and so I deserve this, or it's something that I did different than somebody else, and therefore they deserve the bad things that happen to them. And I see so many personality types when I was incarcerated, and so many personality types from folks that have never been inside that are the exact same. And if you had taken out the supports that some people who've made it had, they would be in prison, or they'd be having addiction, or they'd be homeless. Something in life would have caused them to be in the exact same position as the people who are there. And I look at the folks that are inside, and I look at so many people who have been able to maybe make their way out and survive and succeed. And some of them just have a massive determination. And so there was nothing that was going to get in their way of their second chance of like making it when they get out. So much of what I've seen isn't a matter of the individual. It's a matter of the supports or just the luck of, whether you have some ambitious, powerful element of like push within you to go. And when you kind of break it down, you kind of see that as an element of who's inside and people that have never made it inside.
Sure.
You start to see people differently. You start to see these situations and these systems not so much as you deserve or that's your fault, but what in my life has been there that allowed me to never be at risk of or go there. You talk to guards inside, they'll say things like the only difference between the guard and the person that's incarcerated is you got caught, right?
Sure.
And I didn't.
Yeah.
So many guards inside are getting OWIs, they have drug addiction issues, there's DV, there's just a variety of things going on that they could easily be in that position. So it's just, there's this massive, if not for the grace of God, there go I, element of the whole system. And so I think when it comes to support for me, people will talk to me sometimes or ask me like to tell my story as a success story, right? As an inspirational, you can do it too. And I hate that because I'm not an inspirational, you can do it too. I'm the very obvious, as predictable as puddles after rain result of having support and having no ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, going into the system. So those things allowed me to be where I am now. It's nothing within me that has that. It's just been a myriad of things that have been placed within me and before me that have allowed that. And so if not for that support, if not for the things that I had before I went in that support, I'm not here, right? I'm not in the position I am. I'm in a very much more difficult, struggling situation. And the one story I talk about that I think is interesting about what the system does and the way they approach support is I had been about an hour away from my family for the first 6 years of my incarceration, which wasn't far. I didn't have a great relationship with my parents, so that allowed us time to, like, they would come every weekend and we would talk and we'd get to know each other finally. And we kind of, created a friendship and a real bond that we never really had, maybe since I was a child. I was a very rebellious person. So, like, as I got older, I would start to, like, push back. And my parents, of course, were with that. And so they didn't know how to navigate. My mom was a very different spirit than me, so it was very difficult navigating my spirit. And when I got to this, every year they have you sit in front of the board to determine, are you going to stay where you are, or are you going to move somewhere else? It's called a classification hearing. When I went to that and they said, okay, we have good news, bad news. Good news is we're going to move you to a medium security because I was at maximum security. Mm-hmm. The bad news is we're going to send you like a lot further away. All the options are further. And I said, well, I get these visits all the time. Like, I mean, can I just stay? They had a different area of the institution, maybe like a medium section. I said, can I stay here? And they more or less said, we don't even consider the support that you have. It doesn't come into regard at all for us when we make these decisions.
That's
like
crazy.
It's warehousing. So you are going to go where the next place that's convenient for us is. And that's that. And that's what happened. And I went 4 hours away from home for the next 5 years and got 2 visits from my parents the whole time. That's
wild. And I think, but I'm not surprised to hear that that's not part of the calculus, but also at the same time, touching back on what you said, like, there are things in place that we know can be helpful and effective in, one, reducing recidivism, but also creating the circumstances where people can succeed, right? Yeah. Even beyond any kind of criminal legal context, right? So it's like, what I'm hearing is we know that there are things that we can do that help, and yet we're not really factoring any of that into what we're doing right now because it's just like not it doesn't compute. So I guess that's interesting. The other thing that you brought up that I want to touch on is you had mentioned that, a lot of the guards that you interacted with were also dealing with similar issues, right? And it was, whether luck, circumstance, or just other kind of factors that, either weren't there or were there, created a situation where they had not gotten caught, right? Or whatever. I think that also plays into this idea that like society at large, I think they know what somebody who's been to prison or somebody with a criminal record looks like. And the reality is, I think that couldn't be further from the truth. And I say that from the perspective of, I do all criminal defense work. So I get a variety of people calling me. I've represented people that are police officers. I've worked with people in high professional positions, people that if you saw them on the street, you certainly wouldn't think they had a criminal record, right? And so I think there's this attitude about what we think we know about somebody based on appearances, stereotypes, all of that stuff. But the reality is that I don't think that's true, right? So like, has that been an interesting experience, I guess, for you, just because so much of your work is publicly talking about being somebody who was formerly incarcerated?
Yeah, absolutely. I think even when I was incarcerated, because I have a violent case, right? Okay. And I don't come across in any dangerous way to people, right? And so even when I was incarcerated, it was the same way. People were like, you have that kind of case? And we can speak to why I don't like detail what it is.
Sure.
It's an interesting part of my work as well as explaining storytelling and like language. But I've had that my entire time. And I found it interesting that the people that are part of the demographic that I'm a part of also didn't feel I look like what somebody should be with that case. Right. Or just even in general, just person that has spent that much time in prison. And it's easy for the brain to simplify and pigeonhole and categorize certain things, because that way we can focus on our TV shows, right? Or where we're going to have dinner at, or who we're dating, or whatever other things that are for us more immediate. And so to not have to consider what this idea I have in my mind of a person who has a criminal record is, that gives me free time for other stuff, right? I would argue that you should probably not be working on that other stuff as much, and probably looking at these like biases and stereotypes that you have. But it's a very common thing. I know I have a friend of mine, Josh Johnson, who used to be the state director of apprenticeships, and now he works at a national organization promoting apprenticeships, and he spent like 8 years inside. And he talks about one time he presented to DOC staff. They had him come back in for something, and the entire time he spoke, he was in his suit, as he usually is in a suit. And at the very end of it, he says, my name is Josh Johnson, thank you, also known as, and he says inmate, says his inmate number. Sure. And they were like, they were more or less, I guess, very shocked by that. And some people were also upset, like they felt like they were set up to believe this person was a regular, non-formally incarcerated person, but then like to have the rug pulled out from under them. Like, oh my God, that's like,
such a weird thing to be upset over.
Yeah, you're upset because you were enlightened about something that you
about
probably
somebody
shouldn't
being
have.
Successful, somebody having the experience that we hope, if we actually believe in rehabilitation or any of that, right? Like that is fascinating.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. But it's a very, very common thing that I think I and many of us that have found our way to a life that doesn't seem to align with having been formerly incarcerated are doing. And we get that question a lot. Like, you don't look like X, Y, Z. Like, well, what does that look like? Let's have that conversation.
So in the course of your work, you do a lot of community outreach. I mean, there's a lot of coalition building and things that are involved in terms of your work. What do you think in terms of like the kinds of people that you speak to? Because it's all across the board, right? Like, I mean, when we were talking before, you told me that you presented in front of judges for their continuing legal education kind of conference. And so there's people that are, players to some extent in the system. And then there's also people who are kind of adjacent to it, and they're all sort of related. I mean, what do you think, I guess, what is like the impression, or how do you think people perceive you and kind of the things that you are doing, depending on where they're positioned in that particular system?
I think about that a lot, actually. It's a good question. I find myself to be someone who, even if sometimes I say things that I feel like I have to give the caveat of like, I swear I'm not arrogant, but I'm just being honest about things that I think I've observed about myself. Okay. And I'm told, even if I hadn't been formally incarcerated, I still would be a bit of an outlier. Like, the level of energy and the ability to like break through complex things and just like sit in difficult conversations, those are common traits. And they're very easy for me, actually. And so that is something that I wonder sometimes when I'm talking to people that are in the system or judges. I'm on like a hugging relationship with a number of folks that at one point in their life were putting me away or keeping me locked up in. And so I always ask myself, like, am I a token? Do you genuinely think that I have something to offer? Is this making you have an element in your work of seeming like you're, really with systems change and trying to be,
it feels
a moderate?
good,
Yeah, I always wonder that. I question myself in that regard. I don't dive too far into that thought because there's no way you're gonna have. I'm not gonna have any closure on it, so I just kind of move on from it. But it is always something that I wonder. I think from the behavior that I get, though, that folks sincerely have found inspiration in some of the work that myself and Ruben, who and Adam Procell and Ellie Rivera and Carl Fields, just a variety of us that are doing this work in a way that we present well, we speak well, we are not involved in, anything that you would remotely think is connected to somebody who's formerly incarcerated or involved in criminal activity. And for them, it kind of sparks this, or it fuels this inherent desire for hope and belief in redemption that I think so many times in America we're not seeing, because the media stories are about, there's a criminal activity or somebody gets shot or a car chase or something, and it's like, oh, person was incarcerated at some point.
Sure.
And it's like we always associate, that activity with somebody who's already in the system and got back out, and that whole argument starts up. And so I think it's just refreshing, and they genuinely enjoy helping us and working with us, because we've had doors open for us. I've been at 4 years. Like, the amount of stuff I've been able to do, it doesn't make sense. And it doesn't happen
4 years does not seem like a long period of time for all of the things that you've done. And I'm not saying that to, just like puff up your ego. But honestly, like, you've accomplished so many things and you're doing so many great things. That's wild to think that it's only been 4 years.
Yeah. And it doesn't happen if not for genuine collaboration with a lot of system actors and people who genuinely believe. They're not just doing it because, it's a token feather in the cap, make them feel good thing.
Yeah.
Even though that's surely there.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I think too, to some extent, like, not just you personally, but like, you have to be able to like leverage the doors and opportunities that are open to you when they're open, right? And so I think regardless of perhaps the intent behind something, it gives you the opportunity to present yourself and to, get engaged and talk about those things. And that leads to whatever else, right? So it's like, if you read too much into it, I think it doesn't really do anything that's helpful.
Not at all. And I also am very big on trusting the process. I don't have to know what the result of every conversation is or have to have a specific outcome in mind that I'm aiming for. I believe if I'm just sincerely connecting with people, connecting folks to each other, getting out of the way, just talking about my story in a most effective way that's helping you understand like how it got to that point, how we can avoid that, how we can do better. And even offering a lot of times, there's a line that Kyle Ashley says that I think is great. He got it from somebody else, so I really can't quote him for it. But it's something about like in your relational deposits, always deposit more than you have to spend. And I'm butchering that massively, but it's just to the degree of basically always give more than you're getting back.
Right.
Because that's going to just continually help you and everyone else, and don't have to have a specific, way that you expect things to go.
Right,
it's just going to work out. And that's I trust the process in that regard.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I think a lot of relationship building is an investment that like you don't necessarily know when it's going to pay off, but it always figures itself out somehow. And I really believe that too, because I feel like every opportunity that I have had, it has not come through like a conventional way. It's people that are put in a position to cross paths with me or someone else, and they've always led to other projects or experiences and connections that I am grateful for. So I appreciate that. I was thinking a little bit about when you were talking about
always make more deposits than you do withdrawals. That's what it was.
That's what it is. No, that completely makes sense.
That's what he said.
That's so funny. Always make more deposits than you make withdrawals, which is like a good life lesson anyway. No, but that's funny. I think that, gosh, now I'm blanking. No, I was thinking about CCAP, honestly. And I wanted to talk to you about like your thoughts on CCAP. And I say that because I get a lot of calls from people, or just generally in conversation, where one, I think people don't necessarily understand what information CCAP is actually displaying. Mm. And I think to some extent, this is why, because you were talking about how the media characterize certain things or whatever, and they'll often talk about, here's the charges or whatever. And I think the media, by and large, does a really bad job of really distilling any kind of criminal case into a soundbite, because a lot of times it's not accurate. They're even using words that don't actually apply, but they sound more aggravated or whatever. And to some extent I understand, because they're not necessarily as educated in that realm, but also at the same time, you have a responsibility, if you are the news, to be putting out information that's accurate, especially in the area, or I guess the arena of like social media, all of that kind of stuff, where you'll see your keyboard warriors get really upset over a particular post that's in the sound cycle or in the news cycle about whatever case is out there in the moment. And I think of CCAP a lot when, you know, either clients ask me or family members ask me, like, what does this mean going forward, looking for work, looking for all these kinds of things? Because I think even though there are some things that, you know, for myself, I think like my scale of what I think is pretty benign is skewed because I do this job. Like I understand that like some people are going to look at things with respect to like a criminal history and say, oh, this is like really problematic, whereas I would maybe not think that. You know, I think there's a plus that we have a lot of public information available, but also on the other hand, there's a lot of misinformation or a lack of understanding of what some of that means. And so when I think about like how people navigate trying to get employment, right? So like, yeah, you're not supposed to discriminate based on a criminal record, but we all know that happens from a practical perspective. You know, what are some things that like the general public should know or have a better understanding of as it relates to all this information, right? What does that mean? How do you deal with that? Because I know a lot of the things that you do also focuses on that employment side of things for people trying to get back into you know, just having steady employment and all that stuff. And there's obvious hurdles that come along with that.
Yeah. So you have to stop me at some point if I talk too long, because there's a lot of things to that question to touch on. And one is I will say, I don't know if the media is doing a bad job. I think they're doing a good job for their goal.
Yeah.
When they do
yes,
that. Yeah.
Yes.
So they're doing a bad job for like, you know, societal health and effectiveness.
I guess it's my bad that ratings. I assume that they should put forward accurate information, because I always want to like letter to the editor, like really angry, just like, no, this is inaccurate. Like you should know this, like, you know, whatever. So yes, that's very true.
It's similar to when I have folks that'll like, they'll start their experience with the system, or they'll be the loved one of somebody who's incarcerated, and they're all up in arms on all the things the system's doing, and like, is anyone doing anything about this? Or they should be offering rehabilitation. And I say, so that's where you're wrong. That's actually not their goal. Their goal is just to warehouse you, right? The rest of the stuff is if they have money and time, or if somebody makes them do it. Otherwise, they just want to warehouse you. That's really all they have to do. And so the media is a similar way. Like once you start to understand what they're trying to, or at least maybe have a cynical view about like, you know, they're not trying to help, it makes it easier to accept it. I think of a couple of things. One is when it comes to the media doing that and what CCAP does, right? Because CCAP's making a person's worst decision of their life, worst day of their life, public for everybody to always bring back up and hold against them for decades. And just having, you know, come from Europe where, I didn't get to dive into how accurate this was, but I have it on several people there saying this. You know, some of them were high-level directors of prisons. They don't have anything like that. You can't look anybody up at all. So you get out, you know, somebody might ask you if you were incarcerated. You can tell them yes, but there's no way to verify that. No one can go online and check. And people, I think the complaint or the opposition to removing CCAP, because that's been a conversation for a while. Why do we even have that? And I think some states don't have it as readily available as Wisconsin
There's
does.
definitely others that they have some iteration of it, or it's much more challenging. And I've faced that even looking for what we would normally do is like cursory kind of research on a case for out-of-state convictions. You can't really easily find stuff, which is so unusual because we're so used to having that like at our fingertips here. I mean, you hear people like saying, hey, I'm going on a date with somebody for the first time. Let me CCAP them. So, yeah.
And, you know, to that point, this is, I guess my response kind of ties in with that as well. And a number of things is we have this belief that we should just know that information, right? Like if you did this thing, we should know that, right? That makes us safe. What we don't understand is how we sabotage ourselves. Like human beings don't have a really great grasp of how the brain is, how psychology is, and how we oftentimes make enemies of friends and make friends of enemies. And the information that we're taking in can easily help us go down a path that is going to, you know, very much cause us harm in various areas. And when it comes to people that have a record, if you're looking up somebody and you're CCAPing them, right, and you don't know what that crime means, you don't have any like expertise or understanding or informed idea of the criminal categories of what that possibly could mean, the world of details that can be underneath an actual charge, then you're going to see something and get scared right away. right, about, something that actually may not be remotely scary. But it's further than that. It's a matter of some of these things happened 2, 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Sure.
If a person were to walk up to you and say, what's the worst thing you've ever done in your life? You would be, appalled. Like, why are you asking me that? I'm not going to talk about that.
Right.
So we think that because something's labeled as a crime, or it's actually has the, category of a conviction, that suddenly now that becomes public information that we should all know to determine if this person's safe. But how many folks have never been to prison are probably more unsafe and more dangerous than a person that's been to prison, that have been out here with all types of a myriad of, psychoses or specific, desires that they can't get met, so they flip. All these things, all these stories that exist for how a human being can become dangerous despite the fact they don't have any criminal record. And so we think that we can shortcut to getting to know if a person's safe or not by just a label.
Yeah.
And what you're actually doing is you're oftentimes keeping yourself from having a relationship or hiring or,
Sure.
providing housing for somebody that might be the best person for you in that regard.
Sure.
The same way you get to know, because I've had people say this, well, how do you know? How do you, find that out then? How do you know anyone that you date? How do you know anyone that you meet at work? You're not asking all these people, but you're sitting right next to folks all the time, every day. You're
Sure.
walking past people all the time, every day in the store, who could be the very folks that you maybe should be concerned about, or that you've never asked about. Or I would even argue the folks in your family, as when it comes to sex
Sure.
cases, are actually the ones that are much more going to be the ones that cause that issue than a person that has a conviction of, like, maybe a sex case or something.
Yeah. I guess the only thing I would push back on you in the sex assault realm, which I think is very nuanced, and I here's what I'll say. Like,
Yeah.
from a woman's perspective,
Yeah.
right? If somebody saw that somebody had a conviction for like a 3rd-degree sexual assault, now they're not necessarily going to know what that is. But if somebody's like actively dating, right, and they're like looking up on CCAP and somebody doesn't bring that up, like, you could see where, like, from a safety perspective, there is an element of, a woman would probably like to know that. And I recognize that that's very nuanced as well, because you also have on the flip side, right? Like, when I think of what the definition is for a 4th-degree sexual assault, like, that's just about anybody that's like grabbed you in a club that you're uncomfortable with. Nothing ever came of it, but like, it could be that, right? So I totally hear what you're saying about people not being able to properly interpret what CCAP means. But I also think, there's some stuff that is going to be a little bit more, I guess, obvious than others, as opposed to, things that are a little bit more, when you look at the actual definition of what the crime could be, we don't know the facts, right? But I tend to agree with most of what you're saying, just in terms of, like, we don't know what we don't know about the strangers we interact with.
Right.
But I just say, from a woman's perspective, I could see women taking issue with not being able to, I guess, exercise some sort of agency in terms of, like, interpersonal relationships to that end.
Yeah. I hear that. I think then the conversation becomes, are we finding categories that are still acceptable to CCAP and ones that aren't? And that's
Right.
a very, very
Right.
difficult conversation to have. I think if we're looking at an element of, as a society, are we going to embrace getting to know people, or having like a filtering system that'll keep us from, like, not even going to deal with. I get that.
Right,
I get, like,
right.
as someone who in the last 4 years has had my slings and arrows in regards to, like, relationships. There are certain things you start to say, if this is there, I'm not going to move forward, because
Right.
just based on my experience, the odds are not likely it's going to work out.
Sure.
I'm not even going to deal with that. So, like, that's a justifiable thing, but when we do that, it starts to be a conversation of who's in and who's not, who
Sure.
can be looked at and who can't.
And
So-
then who sets that definition, right?
Exactly. And
Yeah.
then that's the area where we have to either decide everyone's looked at or no one is. And if no one is, then I think that allows for, either way, you're risking a lot of bad things to happen.
Sure.
Which side of these is going to be a principle as a society that we want to live by, that's going to benefit everyone, and that, we're just going to find better ways to get to know folks. It's because it's so interesting, because you're right. You're absolutely right. Like, as a woman, and I've had this conversation with my friend Kaylee before, who we've talked about, she's very big into this work, but that's something that she would want to know. And I'll say, I also know a lot of men who have cases like that, that they're not what their charge would look like at all. And they would never get a second look because of that charge. And so it's such a nuanced thing. So yeah, it's a conversation.
And I think too, like, I approach these things from the perspective of, I always play devil's advocate for everything. However, doing this work, I've seen many cases where people are accused of things that ultimately it's a toss up, or, is a case that like they're saying, this was unfair, but I accepted a plea deal because like at the end of the day, like this is what I wanted to do to kind of just like move forward. So like there's more nuance to it with respect to what you see on paper, right? And then I think the unfortunate part is, again, so you've got documents like a criminal complaint, right? Or an information that's public, public documents, right? But on the other hand, like it's the state's best version of events. That's how I always characterize a criminal complaint. It very often leaves out information and context that is important to understanding what actually happened. And most of the time, it doesn't have anything to do with the client's side of things. And if it does, it cherry picks probably the worst statements that they made, if they made a statement which they shouldn't have made. But regardless, I think that what is available to the general public, I think still is not filtered correctly through like the understanding that one needs to have about what these things mean to make an educated decision. So I think to your point, that's the concern is like, where do we draw the line, or how can we better inform people what this means if that is going to be there? Because it was wild to me that early on in my career, they made a change saying that, okay, if a case has now been dismissed, it goes off of CCAP after 2 years, which is still a long period of time. And assuming that, you're trying to rebuild the reputational damage, like for even people that were not convicted of crimes, that was still on there indefinitely until that was a change that was made. So all of these things that are, more collateral to a conviction in and of itself really, I think, makes it difficult to get those second chances unless you're in the right audience of people that can understand that or are willing to, I guess, make that judgment call and give you a chance.
Yeah. No, and that's exactly right. The thing that I think on top of all of that nuance and the complexity that for me makes it, even though I'm biased, of course, this is my work and this is the space that I'm in, you look at how many folks are in the system of the different racial makeup, right? Mm-hmm. How many folks have the same type of experience, like they actually did the thing that somebody else is convicted of, but because they were able to get out of it because of money or a lawyer or because of prestige, right? So the system's not capturing all these people that are actually potential dangers or did the same thing in their past based on their status or their wealth or their identity in life or their race. And so we have a system that is capturing a specific group way more predominantly than another group. And so we're saying we're going to use all of this, all the arguments around like it has to be known, it has to be public information. We need to know if we're like making decisions and these are people that are safe to put around. But you're only doing it for a predominant number of society that are marginalized. Sure. All the other folks, they don't get that same look because they were able to avoid ever being in the grasp of the system. Sure. And so it's like all of the different realms and arguments and conversations and points that are involved in CCAP and having this thing public, it seems to be so predominantly for me in favor of we should just not even worry about it and go back to when a person gets out, maybe after 2 years, whatever that is. Sure. Like there's data as to after 3 years, you're as likely to go back to prison as somebody who's never been to prison. Sure. We should have a cutoff point where it's not following somebody because as a society, we have so many things that hold a person back just because they have a record or an arrest. Right. Like this, the way the mind goes, you were arrested for that, you did it. Right. That's how we look at it.
I very often, and I'm sure I've said this before, but like one of the most basic voir dire jury selection questions that I do is like, okay, you heard the judge say that, there's a presumption of innocence, but how many people think because this person's sitting here that they must have done something? And many people's hands will go up. I mean, because they can't imagine a situation in which the police intervened and somebody didn't do anything wrong. Not even saying guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, but that somebody didn't do anything wrong, right? So there's already kind of that framework in which people are processing that information with a little bit of skepticism. And then it's interesting too, because as you say, there's truth to, the haves and have-nots. I mean, there's an unfortunate reality, and I say this coming from the perspective of an attorney that works in private practice. I mean, I do a fair amount of pre-charging work. That was something I didn't even know that existed prior to getting into this, but there are things that you can do to get on top of something right away so that it never even gets to the point of going to court. And if it never gets to the point of going to court, it's not going to be on CCAP. You can get that arrest record removed, right? All you need is a letter basically certifying that this was no processed, and that can be removed. And I think that's good, right? To remove arrest records. I do think that there's benefit to it because again, we're talking about all these hurdles that people face down the road if they're, getting a background check for, whatever down the road. I think there's good aspects to that. But to your point, to the extent that we try to say, well, we're doing these things in the name of safety, is that actually the case when there certainly are people who have avoided consequence for whatever reason, whether it's because it couldn't be proved or whatever, couldn't be proven. I don't think I said that right today, but regardless, I think those are all aspects of the conversation that are very often left out, because I think a lot of the discourse around any kind of criminal legal stuff is very fear-based. And by and large, people that are not engaged in any aspect of this work have a very, I think, limited understanding of all of those consequences and implications, but also what it means, right, to be part of the system and to carry that. And I've always said, like, until it happens to you or someone that you love and care about, you may still retain those beliefs because it hasn't impacted you in a way that, it's easy to push that off. It's easy to kind of look the other way when it doesn't impact you personally. So, that's kind of the rant that I always give people when they complain about, like, I can't believe it. Like, my kid's so perfect. Like, they've never been in trouble before. And I can't believe the police are treating them like this. I'm like, well, it's not really a shocker, but, like, I'm sorry that you're experiencing this. Sometimes it, though, takes that experience to realize that this is how the system is designed to operate. And I think the vast majority of, suburban white people probably don't feel that way, right? So it's not true across the board, but I say that anecdotally with the people that I've dealt with over the years, and just also, growing up in Lake Country and going to private school, and those attitudes about policing and things like that are very, very different.
Yeah. I was going to add one more thing about this self-sabotage that we do. So the language part, when folks, and I tell people this, that if somebody's asking you about your crime, you don't have to tell them unless it's like your agent or something.
Sure.
But I tell people, if you're going to do that, just understand what you're getting into. Like, if you want to do it, understand that there's can be a benefit to it, or that can be a harm. And so for me, I've taken the stance some time ago, and there's a reason why. There was an actual experience that happened that made me kind of get away from it. And I tell people my crime is available online. If you're that curious, you can go find out what it is.
Right.
I'm not going to be the one to tell you that. And the reason why is not because I'm trying to run from it. It's something that I have dealt with and grappled with for years, right, deeply. And so it's something that all of my work informs in a very obvious way, I feel. But I tell people, what are you trying to get to, right? And they'll say, I want to know, like, if you are reformed, if you're rehabilitated, right? They want to know if, how much they should be concerned by the crime, whatever it may be. And I say those are valid things you should know, right? I fully agree with that. Let me help you get to that information by better questions. Asking me what I was incarcerated for is not going to get you there. Asking me what I'm doing now, asking me who's around me, asking me, folks that can reference that will say that, Shannon is genuinely doing this, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, exactly.
Going to like lunch with me, like stuff like that, that's going to help you the same way it would be for anyone else you get to know. And so I just tell, folks, we should think about as much as we can, challenging people to ask better questions so they get the answer they actually need. Because I want to help you get that answer. But on my part, on the part of the person that's formerly incarcerated, if I'm having to atone for what I did every single time I talk to somebody,
right,
that becomes a heaviness, which I'm no longer valuable to society and myself the way that everyone would want. So you also want me to be able to exist in this world in a way that I can give the most of myself to society and give back. And that also is not helping that. So in two different ways, that conversation, that question, is oftentimes harmful. And it's oftentimes not getting you to where you want to get to as a person asking.
Right. So I want to ask you this, because we're kind of coming to the end of our conversation here. If you could, what do you think the single most important thing that we as a community at large can do to support people that are transitioning from incarceration to reentry back into the community? What do you think on a large scale perspective is the most important thing that we can do, or in terms of like a policy shift? And I say that because I think there's a lot of conversation around like, what should we do about things? Crime is always like a hot button, media issue. But I think lost in that conversation is, we can't just lock people up and throw away the key. Like, that's not a solution to anything. What can we do to help make sure that people have the tools that they need to be successful.
Well, so 95% of people in prison are getting out, right? I don't think most people understand that.
Yeah.
That's not, people aren't going there to stay there forever. They're coming back. So who do you want coming back is always the essential question we ask. And it's a very difficult question to answer like one thing in a country where so many things are integrated in a way that makes it what it is. The narrative work is always big for me, right? I think if we could have a policy around the news, when they cover something negative, they also have to cover something, equally positive in the opposite way to create that balance.
That's a great idea.
I think that's one that's always stuck out for me is the way that the news talks about things. Like the news should just be a lot more intent on the stories they tell instead of just getting it out and moving on, right? Because you're just shooting into crowds and not even caring like who just got hit when you did that. It's almost, it's a crude analogy, but it's very similar. And direct service wise, I feel that if there was one thing that is the foundation of a person coming home that they need, it's housing. Housing first is a very well-known model across the board for like anyone that's existing in society. If you think of like anything that you do, how do you do that without a place that you comfortably are going to go back to? Like how are you doing some of these things on a daily basis without just decent housing? And so people coming home, that would be the one thing if there was like a direct service at the very root that we should start from, and then everything can kind of be built off of that. So those would be my two answers to that. There's a third one, but I don't think we have time for it, so I'll go with this.
Good. Well, that's a very loaded question because I'm the worst at asking like pointed direct questions unless I'm actually having to do it for my job because I just talk so much. But I appreciate that because those are tangible things that translate to things that people can do that are actionable, right? So I think that's really helpful to kind of guide that conversation. And we might have to have you back to talk about your third answer to that question. We'll see if maybe Ruben can join us too, because that would be a good conversation. He's a great guy. So thank you so much for your time today. And I really appreciate you coming on to talk with me.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode. As always, hit those like and subscribe buttons. Hit us up with your legal questions and stories in the comments below. And rate and review us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. I'm Alexis Garuz, and thanks for listening to Cross Examined.